Welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. Today I'm going to be starting the Starburst Galaxy Block of the Month. This is a 12-month block of the month. The finished quilt is 102 inches square, so it could fit on a queen or a king size bed, or even a full if you like a long drop. I really like this pattern. It's called Starburst Galaxy after the actual Starburst Galaxy because the colors kind of change from the center outward, so it looks like the stars are literally bursting out from the center of this quilt. It really is a cool design when it all puts together. We're basically taking the same star shape and we're making minor variations to it each month. So you have 12 different block designs, but they all kind of adhere to the same overall look in general. So the quilt has the subtle changes, and with the subtle colors it really looks really cool. But if you can do the first month's block, you can definitely do all the rest. So I would definitely check out this tutorial. If it looks like something you can do, then definitely get the Starburst Galaxy pattern book and tackle this quilt for yourself. The most difficult thing in this book is a flying geese unit. I'm going to show you how to make them 4 at a time with no waste flying geese units. It's really pretty simple, and it may change the way you make flying geese forever if you haven't done it this way. I really like it, and it's really accurate results. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do for this and every block in this quilt is we're going to add a little cornerstone to the edge of this larger block. So I'm going to take my little marking pen here, and I'm going to line my ruler up so that it's even with the points of my square. And then I'm just going to draw a line along that center so that I have something to sew on and I can see. It might be a little hard to see that green at home, but definitely just make it dark enough to where you can see it. Now, most of the time when we're sewing triangles, we're sewing next to the drawn line, but for this one, we're actually going to sew right on top of the line because we want to get that nice cornerstone that's even with the rest of the proportions of the block. So you got to sew right on the line to make that happen. So I actually have my needle set to the center position in my machine, so that way it's just a little easier to get it right where it needs to be. And I'm just going to sew right on that drawn line. Now I need to cut this off the corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay this ruler down so that the 1/4 inch mark of my ruler is on top of that seam that we just drew. And now I'm just going to cut this corner off, and I've got my corner now. So when we flip this, it's going to form your square. So I've got to iron this open. And for that, I really just take that iron and press that corner into the edge so that you have a full little corner there. So you're going to repeat that step then with the other corners that you need for the block. And we are making 4 of this block, so you're going to want to make 16 of those. Next up, we're going to make the center. And this is great because we're going to make it 1, but the way the block is constructed is by the time we make 1 unit, you're going to have the center for all 4. So it really is like getting a lot of bang for your buck. Here's how it works. So we're going to be making an hourglass unit for this next section. So just like before, we're going to draw a line down the center of one of our squares. 2 actually, but for this demonstration, we're just going to do the 1. Then I'm going to lay that right sides together with the other fabric that is going to be part of the hourglass unit. Now for this part, we are going to need to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam. So to set that up, what I do is I set my sewing machine to sew a 1/4 inch stitch, and then I move my needle 1 position to the right. And that is just a really accurate way when you're making triangles from squares. That's a really great way to make sure everything is where it needs to be in the end. So now I'm going to sew with that line right next to my presser foot. And I'm going to sew down both sides of that line. I'm going to cut this apart right on that line that we just drew. And it's not super important that you have exactly a 1/4 inch seam on both sides of that line that we sewed, but you don't want your seam to be too skinny either, because then your seam could pop open on the long arm. But for the most part, we already have our accuracy when we sewed next to that drawn line, so it doesn't have to be completely perfect. So now I'm going to take this to my pressing surface. First, I'm going to set that seam just by letting the iron go over it. That helps the threads lay in nice and flat with the fabric. And then I'm just going to press that so that the fabric is underneath, the seam is going to be underneath this print. I need to do that for the other one, because we're going to need both of these. Now, a lot of times we're trimming at when you get to the half square triangle when you use this method, but it's really important that you don't do that for this one. We don't want to trim until we get to the very end. So I flip this so that the wrong side is up, and I'm going to draw a line now from corner to corner across this, what's now a half square triangle. So what I'm doing is I'm getting any inch line lined up with that seam, and then I'm lining up my edges with the point, and I'm going to draw from the center out. And this is going to give us our line to sew our next scant 1/4 inch seam down. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay these right sides together with the other triangle that we sewed, so that the print is facing the more neutral. And I'm going to lay those so that these seams are right next to each other. Now, I can do this by feel. I can feel that those guys are right up next to each other. You shouldn't feel a gap or a overlap here, a bump. But you can also check to make sure you're in the right spot by putting your finger right where that drawn line is and lifting up. And you're going to see that these two, if you've done it right, are coming together perfectly right in that center. And that means that you're good to go. Now, I do recommend putting a pin in this. Once you've done it a couple of times and you feel more confident, this step you can skip. But for right now, go ahead and put a pin in there. So I still have my machine set up to sew a scant 1/4 inch stitch, so now I'm going to do that down both sides of this drawn line. I want to make sure to pause once my sewing machine needle is in that seam allowance, and then remove my pin. You never want to sew over pins. They can break your needle, and that can be kind of dangerous. But if you wait to stop when your needle is in the seam allowance, then that needle will act as a pin, and you can safely remove the one that you have and still be confident that you're going to get a really great join at the center of this hourglass unit. So now I'm just lining up the points at the bottom of these triangles. I'll sew the rest of the way down this side. We're going to flip it around and sew around the other way. Now when you're doing a bunch of these, you can absolutely chain piece them to save time. So just like when we had the hourglass unit, it's now time to cut these apart on that drawn line. And just like before, it's not super important that you're really accurate in getting an exact 1/4 inch seam. Like this seam is a little thicker than this one, but you don't want to get your seam too skinny because that can pop open when you're on the long arm. So now when I open this up, you can see I've got a nice hourglass unit. We're going to press this open, and once you do it with all 4 of these, you're going to have 4 of them and have all the ones you need for your block for block 1, because we're making 4 of these. Go ahead and set that seam. It doesn't really matter what side you press to, just press to a side. So we've got a really good join there, thanks to that pin that we did. Now it's time to trim these up. And there's a couple of things I look for when I'm trimming these blocks. I am making sure that my 45-degree line is along the seam line. It doesn't matter, it can be this one or that one. It just really doesn't matter at all. And then I'm looking to make sure that, in this case I'm trimming to 4.5, that my 4.5 inch mark is hitting right where these two fabrics come together here and up here. And if you take the time to do that and just snug it over a little bit with your fingernail, then you're going to have points that go all the way to the edge of your block, and you're going to get really accurate piecing when we put the entire block together. So now I'm flipping that around, so now my cut edge is on my left and the bottom. So now I can line my 4.5 inch mark up with my left side and my bottom. My 45-degree line is still along that seam line, and I'm still making sure that these seams are coming together right where 4.5 hits the edge of that ruler. So now we have a perfect 4.5 inch hourglass unit with all of our points exactly where they're supposed to be. So this block is just flying by. I'm going to show you how to do the 4 at a time flying geese units. So we're going to make one unit that will make 4 flying geese, which is all we need for this one block. It'll be 16 total because you're making 4. But for the one that we're showing in the video, you're going to be able to make them really quickly. And if you haven't done it before, this method uses no waste. It looks a little funny when we're in the middle of it, but it really is a very accurate way of sewing flying geese units. And you don't have all those triangles left over at the end, which is kind of nice. And I think it's really fast. So let's learn how to do no waste flying geese units. So I've switched to a permanent marking pen so that it will show up on camera. You would not want to use this on your quilt at home. You want to make sure that you choose something that will wash out or iron out. So I'm making my mark from point to point on the wrong side of all of these squares. And to make sure that you get the right measurements and the right fabrics, make sure you go to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com and click on the Block of the Month tab. You can see all the Block of the Month designs that are available there, but this one is Starburst Galaxy. You can get the kit or you can just get the pattern. But if you get the kit, it comes with the pattern, so that's fun. That price is, you basically get the book for free. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so here's where the magic starts to happen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lay these right sides together along my gray neutral square. And again, all the sizes for this are in the book to go along with this. So I've got them lined up here. You can pin this if you want. I generally don't. Whenever I'm making these, there are a lot that I make, so I skip the pinning step, but you certainly can do that. So the machine is still set to a scant 1/4 inch stitch. We're going to want that anytime we're making a triangle from a square, which is what a lot of the construction utilizes in this pattern. So just keep that in mind. So I'm lining this up so that my edge of my presser foot is right on top of that line that I drew. And I'm just going to sew down it. And I kind of slow down a little bit when I get to the center, just to make sure that as I'm transitioning from one of those little squares to the next, that everything stays where it should be. So the rest of the way down that side, then we're going to flip it around and do it one more time. So now we need to cut this apart on that line that we drew, just like before. It really doesn't matter if you're super accurate. Just make sure that none of your seams are too skinny. So now we've got 2 of these, and we're going to press them open. So at this point, it's probably looking a little funky if you've never done this method before. If you've done it right, it's actually going to look like a heart, with the 2 little triangles forming the little tip of that heart, and then your bigger triangle forming the body of it. Go ahead and do that for both of your units that we've cut apart, and then you're going to line your remaining squares up so that the draw line is coming right in the middle of that heart. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew our scant 1/4 inch stitch so that it is coming right out where this little valley is between the little point of our square and the dip here in our triangle. So if you've done it right, your needle and your seam should come out right here on both sides. So I'm just sewing my scant 1/4 inch seam down both sides here. And again, you can chain piece these to save time and thread when you're doing a bunch. Alright, now it's time to reveal that flying geese unit. We're going to go ahead and cut this apart right on that drawn line, just like every time you've done this. Not super important that it's exactly a 1/4 inch, but don't get too skinny. So now it's starting to look a little bit more familiar, because when we press this open, we have 2 flying geese units. And actually you'll have 4, because you'll have another half that you will have turned into 2 flying geese units. So let's press this open and then we'll trim them up. Whenever I'm making flying geese units, I always press a little triangle away from the big triangle. That just is the way that the fabric wants to go, and it really makes it pretty easy. Now, it may be tempting to just leave it like this, but trust me, you're going to want to trim it up. It makes for a lot better construction at the end, because actually we're a little bit over what we should be to have the math work out just right. So what I measure here is, in this case, I'm cutting it down to 2.5 inches tall by 4.5 inches long. So I'm making sure that, again, where my 2.5 and 4.5 come together, that it's right at a point. And where my 2.5 comes off the ruler, that is also at a point. Now, half of 4.5 is 2.25. So I'm making sure that my 2.25 mark is right above where that point is, and that my 1/4 inch line is right on that point. And if all those things are in place, then you're going to have flying geese that line up exactly where they're supposed to be when you sew them together. And I know that might seem like a lot of work, but once you get the hang of it, this really goes really quickly. And when I flip this over, my 45-degree line is also hitting along this triangle, which makes it extra easy to figure out where everything's supposed to be. Just square that up. And this is so worth it, because now we have a perfect flying geese unit, and it really wasn't that hard. So we have one more thing to do to this block. We need to sew a rectangle to it to complete the unit. So I'm going to flip those right sides together, and I'm actually going to sew it with my flying geese unit on top. And I'm going to sew so that my needle is just to the right of where these seams come together. And you can see that the seam got pushed back a little bit on itself. That's fine. It's not a big deal. It'll come out just fine in the end. So I'm finally moving my sewing machine stitch back to a regular 1/4 inch stitch from a scant 1/4 inch. So I just moved it 1 needle width to the left to compensate for the 1 needle width to the right when we moved it earlier. So I'm just going to sew pretty quickly, but I always slow down when I get to that center to make sure that I'm sewing just 1 needle width to the side of where that X is, where the seams come together for the point of the flying geese. That makes your points end up exactly where they're supposed to be. We'll sew the rest of that together. Again, you can chain piece these and save a lot of time that way. Alright, so I'm going to press this open, then we're ready to assemble our block. Now that is a good join. So definitely take that tip and sew so that your seam is just right to the right of where that X comes together. So because this is the first month and we may have some beginners out there giving this quilt a try, I'm going to show you how to assemble the block once you have all the units assembled. This is essentially a 9-patch assembly, which is a pretty simple block if you just have 9 squares. The only difference is there's a few other things going on inside our squares. But if you just look at it as the units themselves, it's pretty easy and it goes together pretty quickly. So what I'd like to do is assemble mine in rows. So first I'm going to put my first row together. So I'm just going to flip that corner piece against the center. If You can pin this if you want, but you don't have to because there aren't any seams to match up in this block. There may be in future blocks, but right now there aren't. I've got my sewing machine still set to a regular 1/4 inch stitch at this point. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew down that seam. Cut that thread. Now I always like to lay mine back out, and that's because I will flip things around and then I will have to rip them out because I sewn them together wrong. But if I lay it back out where the rest of the block is, then I can really easily tell that, yep, I've got that arranged right. So now I'm going to take my other corner unit and flip that right sides together with my center piece for my top row. Alright, so I'm just lining up my corners here. Again, you can pin if you want to. It's all about your comfort level, but if you are liberated from the pins and you hate them like I do, you can definitely skip that. And again, for the full layout instructions and full color diagrams of every step in this block, make sure you go to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com and pick up the pattern book that goes with Starburst Galaxy. Alright, so row 1 is together. Row 2 is going to go together the exact same way. We're just going to flip the edge together. And the one thing you want to make sure here is that you don't turn that hourglass unit going the wrong way. It doesn't matter so much with this quilt or with this block because you really could just flip it once you're all done, but it will in the future. So make sure you're paying attention to the orientation of that center block to make sure it matches what is in the pattern diagram. Lay that back out, and this is still matching what it's supposed to be in the pattern diagram, so that's good. So now I'm going to sew that end piece on. Alright, and we've got our third row together. Now this bottom row together goes together the exact same way as our top row. So just follow the same instructions to sew that bottom row together, and then we'll come back and I'll give you some tips on how to press this. So another way to get really good joins is to make sure that you press seams in opposite directions. So whenever you're looking at a block, you want to look for the path of least resistance. So in this case, this center block is going to give us the most resistance because we have points in all 4 corners. So the fabric is just naturally going to want to go so that the seam is underneath this rectangle because that's really easy. It's just a nice flat one. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move the top and bottom rows out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and press so that this seam is underneath the rectangle. I'm going to do that for both sides. That good and flat. Alright, so if we press this one underneath the outside, then we need to press this seam so that it's underneath the center on both sides. So let's do that. Now we are going to be pressing so that there is a point underneath here. That's okay. That happens. It can't always be really simple on one side and really complicated on another. Sometimes we've got some points to press against, and that's okay. But now, when we pin this together, we're going to have our seams going in opposite directions. We have our top going towards the center and our middle going towards the outside, and that means that we're going to be able to line these seams up really nice so that they just nestle right into each other. So once you've set that up, go ahead and stick a pin in the right side of the seam allowance. And a lot of times, the biggest mistake I see beginners make is when they're pinning, they're putting their pin, like they get it all arranged the way it should be. They get their seams nice and tight against each other, but they'll pin like way down here. And that doesn't help you at all. Because when we sew, we're going to be sewing right here. So if we're pinned here, then that doesn't keep the spot where we need it to be in line in place. So you want to put your pin in about 1/4 inch from the side of that seam, so that way it keeps it in place right where you need it to be. And that'll make sure you have some really good joints. Alright, so we're still using just a regular 1/4 inch stitch here. I'm going to sew along, and I always stop with the needle down in the seam allowance, and then I remove my pin. Keeps it from breaking, and it also acts as a pin, keeping everything in place so you have great joints. Alright, now I line up these corners in the back just to make sure that everything is good to go. You can pin that too if you wanted to. I just kind of hold it in place with my pointer finger. Alright, we have our first row attached. Time to see what it looks like. Alright, I'm setting that seam so that the thread lays nice and flat within the fabric. Press that up. Now when you're pressing, you want to make sure you're not like ironing around. This isn't a shirt. You can definitely stretch that out, especially with all these triangles you sewn on the bias. That can get a little stretchy. So you definitely want to be respectful of all that. But as you can see here, we have some really good joints going on here. We have our joints here that came together pretty good. And our points are pretty much exactly where they need to be. They're a little off, but by the time I get it quilted, no one's ever going to know. So now I've just got to get this pressed so that the seams are underneath that center, and then I can sew this on as well. Well, this is it. We have block 1 done of the Starburst Galaxy Block of the Month quilt from Quilt Addicts Anonymous. This one's pretty light. They get a lot darker as they go out. Again, it creates that effect of the stars just kind of exploding and getting brighter and brighter as we go out further into the galaxy. So if you've enjoyed this quilt tutorial, definitely check out the pattern book. This is the first year that I've done printed pattern books instead of the digital PDFs, and this is great. This is a 36-page book with full color instructions. It takes you through everything you need, from how many yards and the swatches and things that you need, to cutting instructions, to block diagrams, to how it all goes together in the end. So this is a really great book, really high quality printing, and it's been professionally tech edited so there are no mistakes. And so definitely check that out and add that to the quilts that you have to do. Now, for the special video tutorial discount, if you purchase a quilt kit to go with this, say you like the way that this looks so much that you want the kit too, you can save $25 on the quilt kit. And I have not offered a discount to like the wide audience on this at all. So this is your only chance to get a discount on this quilt. You can save 25 bucks if you order the quilt kit by the end of January. And that's January 2017 if you're watching this a couple years from now, because I know there will be a few of you who are. So go to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, add the Starburst Galaxy quilt kit to your cart. This only works on the big one, not the layaway quilt. And use the coupon code QAA Galaxy, and you can save 25 bucks on that quilt kit. And I've got 2 in stock now, and I have a couple, well, a lot more arriving in February. So if it's on back order, go ahead and order it. You can still get your discount, and then that will arrive in February for you, and you can get started on everything. So thanks so much for following along. I hope you enjoy this block of the month, and happy quilting.